Well, I think this show itself is a very good indicator of how LTE has developed. In the 7 years since this show has been running, we've seen population rise from something like 50 participants in the very first show to over 2,000 registered participants here today. So you can see that over a 5-year time span, LTE has really become something of a household name now. So from my point of view, it's a great success. Yeah, I'm always rather critical of analysts and forecasters because certainly in telecoms, most of the forecasts we make tend to be wrong. Either we underestimate or we are too ambitious about timescales, and LTE is no exception. I think LTE was much later coming to market than we first expected, but now it has come to market. The rate of growth is at a level we could never have imagined. In fact, the Global Suppliers Association now say that LTE is the fastest growing mobile technology ever because the rate at which networks are being deployed surpasses any of our predecessor technologies. Making the technology work is one thing, making it commercially viable and profitable is quite another. And I think we're at the stage now where we're quite sure that the technology is viable. From an engineering point of view, we see the early deployments working as expected, in fact working in some cases much better than was first expected. But it'll take some time before we see whether or not the commercial viability behind this technology is fully realized. So as we move forward, it's really a case of taking very steady and progressive steps forward rather than leaping forward, making sure that we learn from the errors of the first deployers, maybe learn from their experiences, and make sure that the ecosystem as a whole develops for the benefit of all. From a standardization point of view, 3GPP plays no judgment in whether or not the proposal to include a band for LTE is good or bad. So if a country or a nation or a region comes to us and says they need LTE specified in a particular band, then we will do that. What that means is there are over 40 bands in which LTE is now specified, which is good from the point of view it gives operators choice and maybe allows them to operate in regions where otherwise they would not be able to do so. But from a global roaming point of view, there is a disaster looming because surely the radios of the future will not contain all 40 of those bands. So there has to be some rationalization if we are to achieve global roaming on the sort of scales that we need to achieve. Well, there are certainly challenges, and I think it's always hard for a vendor because the vendor is waiting to receive an order to produce equipment, and of course is reluctant to ramp up production until those orders are in place. And as I explained earlier, the deployment of LTE was slightly later than we first predicted, but now it has launched. It's growing at a rate that we never expected. This places an enormous burden on device manufacturers who now have to ramp up production from what initially was thousands to now millions of terminals. I mean, it's a big step forward, if you like, in terms of production capability. Oh, I think it's a really interesting time. If you look at the projections, there are some 200 operator commitments. These are operators who have decided that they will deploy the technology at some stage or other. We've noted that the rate of deployment is far greater than we initially expected, so we expect to see a number of network launches before the end of this year. If we couple that with the availability of, say, a smartphone with LTE capability, you can expect enormous growth in terms of traffic being carried on LTE networks by the end of this year. So from my point of view, I think it's a very exciting year. So it was a very interesting discussion this morning based on NTT Docomo's presentation, where they were a little bit critical, if you like, of always continuing to enhance legacy technologies. Well, of course, that has been done so that those operators who have no choice but remain with that legacy technology still have some viable future. But if we look at what happens in terms of standardization as a whole right now, personally I had expected that the rate of development of standards would have started to decline because Release 8, Release 9 LTE has been available for some time now. They're very stable releases, and I predicted that the work program would start to slow down. And in fact, we've seen quite the opposite. We've seen a growth in the number of delegates coming to meetings, a growth in the number of contributions they bring. So the whole intellectual input coming into the project continues to grow, which I must say was a surprise to me, although very welcome that industry continues to invest so heavily in standardization. I think all events of this nature are important. It enables delegates to hear the view from the others, and perhaps from some parts of the ecosystem which we don't typically hear from throughout the working year. If you look at the programme here today, it's a very broad, varied programme with contributions coming from all sectors of our ecosystem. So I think it plays a very important role in sharing the knowledge that we have to make sure that we progress forward as an ecosystem for the benefit of all.